Hello, my name is Maddie Felice, and this is my presentation on competency to consent to research for advanced forensic psychology. So, competence to consent to research can be defined as the subcategory of consent doctrine to participate in research, which basically means that it's the set of beliefs that help us determine whether or not an individual is competent enough to engage in a research study. There are two kinds of research studies. There's social and behavioral, and then the one we'll be discussing today is biomedical research. There are huge ethical concerns involving individuals with questionable competence being involved in a biomedical research. There can also be an increase of tension between the relationship of a participant and the clinician, mainly focused on the participant's autonomy and their own rights versus a clinician's paternalism, which is their decision making that they would like to do throughout the research process. And since there is no direct participant benefits to do a research study, this can hinder the relationship between the two if everything is not discussed prior. So, important context for compensated consent to research is that the legal framework that we use is based off of the Nuremberg Code. This code was enacted after the Nazis' medical experiments in World War II. This protects participants in research from being coerced or forced to join a study against their will and ensures that they have a full understanding of all the research that's being performed. The Department of Health and Human Services are the ones that provide the rules and regulations for all research conducted within the United States, and our international review boards are the ones who enforce these regulations throughout all the studies. So the legal requirements based off the Department of Health and Human Services, they do require certain disclosures to be given to all participants before they start the experiment. This is going to be explaining their involvement, purpose, duration, and other identifications within the research. They are allowed to know the foreseeable risks that can happen, if there are any benefits, if there are alternative options for them besides doing this research experiment, and their confidentiality throughout. They should also know what the risk factors are, and if one does occur, are they going to be compensated for it? They also have the right to have an individual that they are able to contact throughout the experiment at any point in time to discuss their own rights, basically just allowing them to feel comfortable throughout the whole research experiment. And lastly, we do need a documented statement of voluntary participation. This is just providing evidence that they do consent to be in this research. And although that these are legal requirements, the International Review Board does hold authority to waive these disclosures if they deem that there's very minimal risk. So minimal risk in this context is going to be based on the risk factor, not only to the people within the research group, but the entire population. So if there is a high probability that this risk is going to occur, but it is a very low risk, that is fine. And even if it is a really high magnitude risk, if the possibility of it happening is so low, the review boards can deem that as minimal as well. And along with the confidentiality, we don't want to overpromise them that they're going to be completely anonymous if that is not going to be true. Now, there are always exceptions to the rules, and regarding competency to consent to research, there are certain groups that require additional elements of informed consent. An example of prisoners, they are only acceptable subjects if the research itself is designed for studying criminal behavior or incarceration, and the risks are tolerable for non-prisoner participants. So going back to what we said before, the risk factors should be based off the general population, not just inmates. And another thing for prisoners is that there has to not be any incentives that can coerce them to partake, such as serving less sentencing. Children on the opposite side of the spectrum also are a special group that need additional regulations. Not only do we need the approval from the child, but we also need consent from their parents as well. The risks should always be minimal dealing with children. But like I said before, the international review boards do have the right to intervene when there's necessary. So they can actually waive parental consent if they deem that there is potential harm that can happen to these kids, regardless if the parent consented to the experiment. And of course, anyone that has a mental illness, they are recognized as a very vulnerable group who need intentional protection within the research community. Now, regarding research, it is assumed that those with more severe mental illnesses do show weaker signs of cognitive comprehension than those with lesser. Think of schizophrenia compared to depression. However, it has been found that people with mental illnesses tend to show the same competence related abilities as individuals who do not have mental illnesses, which means that the impaired competence is more likely linked to cognitive deficits rather than mental delusions. And that can lead to the assumption that competence should not be based on the presence of mental illness. If a person does have mental illness and you can tell that this is leading to a poor initial screening, this can be addressed by having consistent and ongoing dialogue between them throughout the whole study. Only if the mental illness isn't so detrimental to their understanding. Now, there are three major factors that need to be addressed by clinicians when assessing an individual's competence for research. So, the major umbrella is therapeutic misconception, which happens when participants mistake the purpose of research. A lot of them don't understand that treatment is very different to research studies. So, they see this as a way for them to receive treatment rather than them being the ones who are testing the effectiveness of treatment. This can lead to confusion between risk assessments between consent for treatment and consent for research, as well as the motivations of each of the participants. So it is very important for the researcher doing this that they establish those guidelines. The evaluations themselves do mirror the procedures of assessing treatments since there are similarities between. However, it is very important, like I said before, that the researchers do emphasize research aspects in the evaluation process, and they must fully explain to the potential participants what the difference is between treatments versus research. The participants need to understand that they, one, have freedom to withdraw from the study without any repercussions. There is no benefit. If there is, it's very limited for participating in the research since treatment is not expected. And three, there is really no incentive for them to participate in the study, so they are doing this out of their own willfulness. To perform these evaluations, the tool that we use is the MACCAT-CR. It provides the best structure to assess the capacities and competence abilities related to consenting to research. The only requirement is that the evaluations must be specifically constructed towards the nature of research. And like we mentioned before, a very important factor is that there has to be documentation of informed consent to research. This will help confirm the participant is willingly in the study after hearing all of the information mentioned above. And those who do not appear to be competent due to mental illnesses and other factors, they do have opportunity in some cases to go through educational strategies, which can improve their comprehension towards competency. This is not a common method during evaluations, but in certain circumstances, this can be done through repeated learning trials and video educational interventions. So the video that I have linked is a particular study that was done to focus on individuals who have aphasia, which is a type of memory loss. I'll have you guys just watch the first 5 minutes of this video, and you'll actually be able to see a really great example of how these evaluations should be done between the clinician and individual, to basically assess whether or not the participant has competency to consent to research. I think it is a really good example of everything that we've been talking about. And my discussion question for you guys is that with all the similarities between competence to consent to research and the competence to consent to treatment, how can we further prevent and deal with the therapeutic misconceptions that participants have about research studies? And here are my references for the presentation. I hope you all have a lovely day.